The bonfire had been burning for hours, casting dancing shadows across the faces of teenagers who thought they were invincible, thought that nothing bad could touch them in a town like Brookfield, where everyone knew everyone, where the worst crime was usually someone stealing gas from the Texaco station. It was July 23, 1982, a Friday night thick with summer humidity that made the air feel like wet cotton. Sarah Mitchell, 19 years old with auburn hair that caught the firelight like copper wire, and freckles scattered across her nose like constellations, had spent the evening at Miller's farm just past the old railroad crossing, where kids had been gathering for years to drink beer and listen to music blasting from car stereos. She wore cut-off denim shorts, a white tank top, and worn Converse sneakers that had once been blue but were now faded to gray. Around midnight, she told her best friend Kelly Robinson that she was tired, that she was going to walk home. Kelly offered to drive her, but Sarah declined, saying the walk would clear her head, that she needed the air, that she would be fine. Brookfield was safe, everyone said so. Kelly watched from beside the bonfire as Sarah waved and disappeared down the dirt road, her silhouette swallowing into darkness within seconds. Kelly would spend the rest of her life replaying that moment, wishing she had insisted, wishing she had not let Sarah walk away alone. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and the time, because it's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. Sarah never made it home. The distance from Miller's farm to the Mitchell house on Sycamore Avenue was approximately 3 miles, most of it along Route 47, a 2-lane country road that cut through farmland and patches of forest. There were no streetlights, no houses for the first mile and a half, just fields of corn that rustled in the night breeze and the occasional deer crossing. Sarah had walked this route before, not often but enough times that she knew it by heart. When her mother Diane Mitchell woke Saturday morning and found Sarah's bed empty, her first thought was not panic. Sarah was 19 after all, practically an adult. Maybe she had stayed at Kelly's house, maybe she had met someone. But by noon, when phone calls to friends yielded nothing, Diane felt the first cold finger of fear touch her spine. She called her husband Michael, who was at his hardware store on Main Street, and he came home immediately, his face tight with concern. They drove to Miller's farm but found it deserted, just tire tracks in the dirt and beer cans scattered in the grass. They called the police. Chief Raymond Boswell arrived at the Mitchell house within 30 minutes. Compact man in his early 60s with a crew cut gone white, and a face weathered by 4 decades of small-town police work. He took notes in a leather-bound notebook, asking questions in a calm, steady voice that was meant to be reassuring. Sarah was responsible, Diane told him. She did not do drugs. She had a boyfriend named Marcus Hayes, who had been at the bonfire too, who had left early because he had to work the morning shift at his father's construction company. No fights, no drama, no reason to disappear. Chief Boswell organized a search party by late Saturday afternoon. 40 volunteers walked Route 47 with flashlights and handheld radios, calling Sarah's name into the humid dusk. They found nothing. No shoes, no purse, no sign of struggle. By Sunday morning, the search expanded. Bloodhounds tracked her scent from Miller's farm down Route 47 for nearly a mile, before losing it completely near the intersection with Old Mill Road, a desolate stretch where farmland gave way to dense woods on the eastern side. Witnesses emerged slowly. A man named Eugene Potter, who owned a dairy farm near the intersection, said he had been in his barn that Friday night around midnight, checking on a sick cow, and had heard a vehicle idling on the road, but had not looked outside. Another witness, a woman named Barbara Chen, who lived 2 miles down Old Mill Road, said she had been driving home late from her sister's house and thought she saw someone who might have been Sarah, standing near a dark pickup truck. But the night had been so dark she could not be certain. She had not stopped. She carried that guilt with her every day afterward. The investigation proceeded with the uncertain rhythm of a police department that had never handled a disappearance like this. Chief Boswell interviewed everyone who had been at the bonfire, collecting statements on carbon copy forms. Marcus Hayes was questioned 3 times, his alibi verified by his father, Gerald Hayes, who confirmed Marcus had been home by 1 a.m. and had left for the construction site at 6 a.m. Marcus broke down during the third interview, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper cup of water Boswell offered him. Days turned into weeks. Sarah's photograph appeared on flyers posted at every business in Brookfield, taped to windows, printed in the Brookfield Courier beneath the headline, "Local Teen Missing." Diane stopped eating. Michael drove Route 47 every night, his headlights sweeping across empty fields, searching for any sign of his daughter. Chief Boswell sat in his small office at the Brookfield Police Department, a converted storefront that still smelled faintly of the bakery it had once been, staring at the stack of reports that led nowhere. It was August now, 2 weeks since Sarah Mitchell had vanished, and the case felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The technology available to him was limited. Fingerprint cards sent by mail to the state crime lab in Columbus, photographs that took days to develop, witness statements typed on electric typewriters with carbon paper for duplicates. There was no DNA testing, no national databases, no security cameras, just persistence and hope. The partial tire tracks photographed near Old Mill Road came back inconclusive. They were common tread patterns consistent with dozens of truck models. Boswell had sent Sarah's dental records to surrounding counties in case a body was discovered, a task that made bile rise in his throat. He had known the Mitchells since Michael opened his hardware store 12 years ago, had watched Sarah grow up, seen her win the county spelling bee in 8th grade, waved to her when she rode her bicycle past the station. This was not supposed to happen in Brookfield. The interviews produced contradictions that gnawed at him. Barbara Chen changed her story, saying first the truck was black, then dark blue, then maybe brown. She thought there might have been someone in the driver's seat, or maybe the truck was empty. The darkness made everything uncertain. Eugene Potter was more consistent but offered nothing useful. Yes, he had heard an engine. No, he had not investigated. It was past midnight and he was exhausted. He wished he had paid attention. Everyone wished they had paid attention. Boswell returned to the intersection dozens of times, standing in the August heat trying to reconstruct what had happened. If Sarah had been taken by force, there should have been evidence of a struggle. If she had gotten into a vehicle willingly, why and with whom? Marcus Hayes remained a suspect in some people's minds, simply because he was the boyfriend, because statistics said that was usually how these things went. But his alibi was solid. His father swore Marcus had been home. His work record showed he clocked in at the construction site at 6:15 Saturday morning. Boswell had driven the route from Miller's farm to the Hayes house. It took 14 minutes. There was no window of time for Marcus to have intercepted Sarah, done something terrible, and still maintained his timeline. Still, Boswell brought him in again, watching for inconsistencies. Marcus sat across the metal desk in the cramped office, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. He repeated the same account. He had left the bonfire around 11:30 because he had an early shift. He had kissed Sarah goodbye, told her to be careful driving home. He had expected to see her Saturday evening. They had plans to go to the movies. When she did not show up, did not answer her phone, he had driven to her house and found Diane hysterical. Boswell believed him, but belief was not proof, and the town demanded answers. Rumors spread through Brookfield's 8,000 residents like wildfire. Some said Sarah had run away to California, that she was pregnant, that she wanted to escape small-town life. Others whispered about a secret relationship, about drugs, about money owed to dangerous people. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the need to understand chaos. Diane Mitchell heard the whispers and stopped leaving her house except to drive to the grocery store, moving through the aisles like a ghost. The state police sent a detective named Frank Zimmerman, a methodical man with wire-rimmed glasses who asked all the same questions Boswell had already asked. Zimmerman reviewed the files, walked Route 47, examined the intersection. After 4 days he returned to Columbus with nothing new except condolences and a promise to keep the case active. By September, as the heat began to break and leaves started turning gold along Route 47, the active investigation slowed to a crawl. Boswell still worked it, still followed up on tips that came through the station's phone line. But there was nothing concrete to pursue. Sarah Mitchell had simply disappeared, swallowed by the summer night, leaving behind only questions and a family that would never recover. Brookfield had always been the kind of community that existed in postcards, where neighbors borrowed tools and returned them, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and where the 4th of July parade was the most exciting event of the year. Main Street stretched for 8 steady blocks, lined with family-owned shops whose signs had faded under years of Ohio sun. Patterson's Hardware, Michael Mitchell's pride, stood near the corner of Sycamore Avenue, beside Rossi's Diner, where waitress Linda Murphy had been serving eggs and black coffee for nearly 2 decades. Across from them was the Regal Theater, still showing weekend double features on film reels that crackled with static. The people of Brookfield went to church on Sundays, First Baptist or St. Mary's, depending on which side of town they lived on, and filled the bleachers at high school football games every Friday night. They gathered for community center potlucks, exchanged Christmas cookies, and waved to each other at red lights. It was a rhythm so steady, so ordinary, that no one believed it could ever be broken. But Sarah Mitchell's disappearance did just that. It didn't just take one girl. It took the town's peace, its sense of safety, the invisible web of trust that held everything together. By October 1982, 3 months after that humid July night, Brookfield had become a place of whispers. Parents who once let their teenagers stay out past midnight now enforced strict curfews. Porch lights that once went dark before bed now stayed burning until dawn. Women who used to jog along Route 47 in the early morning now moved in pairs, scanning the tree line for headlights or footsteps. Even the dogs seemed to bark more often, as if they too sensed something broken in the air. At Rossi's Diner, where the coffee was always hot and the gossip hotter, conversations that once revolved around crop yields or high school scores now circled endlessly around the same unsolvable question: who took Sarah Mitchell? Theories multiplied faster than anyone could keep up with. Some pointed to drifters, seasonal workers, they said, who came through town for the farms and left without a trace. Others whispered about truck drivers who stopped at the Texaco station at odd hours, about the old railroad tracks that ran south of town, and the shadows that seemed to move there after midnight. The drifter theory was comforting. It meant the monster was gone, somewhere far away, faceless and untraceable. It meant Brookfield could return to normal, but others weren't convinced. Eugene Potter, the dairy farmer who had reported hearing a truck idling near Old Mill Road that night, found himself under quiet scrutiny. Why hadn't he looked outside? What had he really been doing at midnight? His wife, Helen, noticed people crossing the street to avoid her at the grocery store. Conversations ended when she entered the post office. They had become, without anyone saying it aloud, the family who didn't help. If the Potters carried the town's suspicion, Marcus Hayes carried its rage. Despite his verified alibi, his father confirming he was home before 1, and despite Chief Boswell's repeated public statements clearing him, part of the town simply refused to let go of the idea that it had to be him. Rumors evolved into stories, and stories hardened into certainty. Some claimed Marcus had hired someone. Others believed his father had lied. Someone even whispered that Sarah had been pregnant, that Marcus had panicked. None of it was true, but truth had stopped mattering. One morning, Marcus found the word murderer spray-painted in red across his front door. A brick shattered the window of his truck while it sat parked outside Rossi's. His mother, Carolyn, who had spent 20 years as a secretary at Brookfield Elementary, lost half her friends within weeks. They stopped calling, stopped smiling at her in church. She started sitting alone in the back pew. By December, Marcus quit his job at his father's construction business and left Brookfield altogether. He told people he was moving to Toledo for work, but everyone knew he was running from something much heavier, the eyes that followed him everywhere. Meanwhile, the Mitchell family's grief became the town's silent backdrop. Michael kept Patterson's Hardware open, But the once friendly man who offered neighbors advice on nails and paint now seemed absent, counting change with trembling hands, forgetting orders mid-sentence. Diane returned to her bank teller job that October because staying home made the silence unbearable. Her co-workers pretended not to notice when she disappeared into the restroom to cry, and their son David, just 15, learned that grief could make a person invisible. His classmates avoided him in hallways, not out of cruelty but because they didn't know how to look at him. He stopped sitting with anyone at lunch. He stopped speaking altogether in class. Chief Boswell watched all this unfold with a weight he couldn't set down. He'd been police chief for 12 years, and Brookfield had never asked much of him. A few traffic stops, a break-in every other winter, maybe a bar fight when the football team lost. He had believed, honestly believed, that he could keep people safe. Now, every time he walked into Rossi's for lunch, a dozen pairs of eyes followed him, waiting for news he didn't have. Every question he couldn't answer became another fracture in the foundation of trust that had built his entire career. The mayor, Arnold Fletcher, a nervous insurance salesman turned politician, began to panic about the town's reputation. He called Boswell into his office one morning in early November, and after clearing his throat twice, suggested that perhaps it was time to accept a different narrative. "Maybe she ran away," Fletcher said, hands folded neatly on the desk. 19 is old enough. Maybe she wanted something bigger than Brookfield. Boswell stared at him for a long, silent moment before walking out. He didn't bother to close the door. By winter, the search had slowed to nothing. The state police had packed up, the bloodhounds were gone, and the volunteers had gone back to their lives. Sarah's bank account remained untouched. Her purse, clothes, and half-finished journal sat untouched on her dresser. It was as if she had simply evaporated, but something deeper changed, too. Something in the town's soul. Brookfield, once defined by its closeness, began to fray at the seams. Old friends stopped talking. People locked their doors for the first time. Teenagers whispered ghost stories about Route 47, daring each other to drive it after dark. A few claimed they'd seen headlights that vanished mid-turn, or heard a girl's voice in the cornfields calling for help. The story of Sarah Mitchell began to mutate from tragedy into myth. Spring 1983 brought wildflowers and a kind of uneasy calm. The posters that once covered every telephone pole had faded in the sun, Sarah's smile bleaching to white. The rain had torn most of them away, leaving only scraps that fluttered in the wind. The town's collective grief hardened into something quieter, less visible. At the Brookfield Community Center, bake sales and church gatherings resumed. The football team played again under the same Friday lights. People laughed again, but softer now, like they were afraid to wake something. The Mitchells still placed a light in their window every night, the bulb burning through the dark, and though no one said it aloud, everyone in Brookfield saw it when they drove past. Chief Boswell continued his work, though each day felt like a performance. He still opened Sarah's case file every morning, flipping through the same typed reports, the same photographs of tire tracks, as if repetition could summon meaning. The edges of the papers had yellowed. His notes had become smudged with fingerprints. He kept telling himself he would find something new, some angle he'd missed. But deep down, he knew the truth. The case was going cold. The following March, a year after the disappearance, Boswell attended a state police conference in Columbus. He brought Sarah's file with him, hoping someone might offer a fresh idea. A detective from Cleveland flipped through the photos, sighed and said what Boswell already knew. Without a body, there's nothing to prove. Driving back to Brookfield that night, the chief watched the empty highway blur past and thought about Sarah's parents waiting at home. He thought about the rumors, the whispers, the weight of failure. He didn't know it yet, but that drive would be the last time anyone from the state police would ask about Sarah Mitchell for decades. Back in town, life kept moving, even if it didn't feel like living. The diner's jukebox kept playing. The corn grew tall again. A new family moved into the corner house on Elm Street, repainting the porch blue. To a stranger passing through, Brookfield might have looked perfectly normal again. But those who had lived through that summer knew better. Something had changed forever. Something in the way people looked at one another. By the time spring 1983 turned into summer, the investigation was all but forgotten outside of the Mitchell household. The flyers were gone. The volunteers had stopped calling. Only Chief Boswell, sitting in his cramped office beside the old furnace, still believed that one day the truth might rise again. And in the quiet basement of the Brookfield Police Department, a cardboard box sat untouched on a steel shelf. On its label, written in fading black ink, Mitchell Sarah Ann, missing person open. It would remain there for 27 years, waiting. The file labeled Mitchell. Sarah Ann lived in a cardboard evidence box in the basement of the Brookfield Police Department, tucked beside a furnace that rattled and a shelf of forgotten reports. By 1987, Chief Boswell had retired, replaced by a younger man named Victor Lang, who had never met Sarah, who knew the case only as a cautionary tale. By 1992, the box had been moved twice to accommodate new files, new unsolved cases, new tragedies. By 1998, when the department computerized its records, Sarah's case was entered as cold. Her status officially changed from missing person to presumed deceased. Though no body had ever been recovered, the Mitchell family never stopped searching. Michael and Diane aged in the way that unresolved grief ages people, suddenly and in stages. Michael's hair went completely white in 1985. Diane developed arthritis that made her hands ache, that made holding coffee cups difficult. They kept Sarah's bedroom exactly as she had left it. The posters on the walls, the textbooks on the desk, the Converse sneakers in the closet, because they had never been found with her. Because she must have been wearing different shoes that night. A detail that haunted Diane because she could not remember what. Every year on July 23rd, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Diane placed a notice in the Brookfield Courier. The text never varied. Sarah Ann Mitchell, missing since July 23, 1982. If you have any information, please contact the Brookfield Police Department. We have never stopped searching. We will never stop loving you. The notices cost $38 each year. Money the Mitchells could barely spare after the hardware store struggled through the recession of the early 90s. But Diane insisted. Someone might remember something. Someone might finally speak. David Mitchell, Sarah's younger brother, graduated high school in 1985 and left Brookfield for college in Cleveland, then stayed, building a life away from the town that meant only loss. He visited his parents twice a year, Christmas and Sarah's birthday in March, visits that left everyone drained. David married a woman named Jennifer Park in 1994, had a son, worked as an accountant, constructed a normal existence on top of the foundation of his sister's absence. But he dreamed about Sarah constantly, dreams where she asked why he had stopped looking, why he had abandoned her. Marcus Hayes left Brookfield in 1983, unable to endure the whispers, the suspicion that clung to him like smoke. He moved to Pittsburgh, worked in construction, drank heavily for years, eventually got sober and started a landscaping business. But he never married. He told friends it was because he had trust issues. But really it was because he could not imagine loving someone that deeply again. Could not survive another loss like that. The town itself evolved slowly, the way small towns do as America moved through the 80s into the 90s. The railroad stopped running through Brookfield in 1991. Main Street began to empty as shopping shifted to the new Walmart on Route 47, near the intersection where Sarah had vanished. Patterson's Hardware closed in 1996, unable to compete. The Regal Theater shut down. Young people left for jobs in Columbus and Cincinnati, and did not return. But Sarah's case remained embedded in Brookfield's identity, a dark thread woven through its history. New residents who moved to town for affordable housing eventually heard the story from longtime neighbors, learned about the girl who disappeared, understood that Brookfield was a place where something terrible had happened and never been solved. The case appeared in true crime magazines occasionally, brief paragraphs summarizing the known facts, speculating about serial killers or random abduction, offering no insights. Chief Lang kept the file accessible even as it gathered dust. Every few years someone came forward claiming information. A supposed confession heard secondhand, a psychic vision, a recovered memory. Lang investigated each lead methodically, finding nothing credible. In 2001, when DNA databases became more common in law enforcement, he submitted the tire track casts and fingerprint cards for reanalysis, hoping new technology might reveal something useful. The results came back unchanged, insufficient for identification. Diane Mitchell died in 2004 of a stroke, collapsing in her kitchen while preparing dinner. Her brain simply giving out after 22 years of carrying impossible weight. Michael followed in 2006, lung cancer taking him quickly, mercifully. On his deathbed at Mercy Hospital, he held David's hand and whispered, "Find her, please find your sister." David promised he would, though he had no idea how. The spring of 2009 brought unusually heavy rains to Brookfield, the kind that flooded basements and washed out roads, turned fields into muddy lakes. Construction company from Columbus had purchased 80 acres of land along Old Mill Road, the same stretch where Sarah Mitchell had last been tracked 27 years earlier. The plan was to clear the forest and build a housing development called Meadowbrook Commons. 40 single-family homes marketed to young families seeking affordable housing within commuting distance of Columbus. The irony of the location was not lost on older Brookfield residents, those who remembered 1982. But the town council approved the permits because tax revenue was desperately needed, and because even communal grief eventually loses its power to stop progress. The construction crew arrived on May 4th. A Monday morning clear and bright after days of rain. They established a site office, unloaded bulldozers and excavators, marked boundaries with orange stakes. The foreman, a man named Dale Hutchins from Akron, was in his 50s, efficient and uninterested in local history. His job was to clear land, grade it, prepare it for foundations. He had done this countless times before. By Wednesday, the excavator operator, Luis Mendez, had cleared nearly 2 acres of forest, pushing through undergrowth and topsoil, uprooting trees and scraping away decades of accumulated leaf matter. The machine's diesel engine roared as it worked, the massive bucket tearing into earth that had not been disturbed since the land was farmland in the 60s. Mendez was experienced, methodical, watching the ground for rocks or debris that might damage equipment, which is why he noticed when the bucket caught on something that felt different. He stopped the machine, climbed down, walked over to investigate. What he found made his stomach drop. Protruding from the torn earth was fabric, rotted and stained but unmistakably clothing, and beneath the fabric, partially exposed, was bone. Mendez backed away quickly, his heart pounding, shouted for Hutchins. Within minutes the crew had gathered, staring into the crater the excavator had created. Hutchins, who had seen enough to recognize trouble, pulled out his cell phone, dialed 911. Chief Victor Lang arrived within 15 minutes, accompanied by 2 deputies and the county medical examiner, a thorough woman named Dr. Patricia Osman, who carried her instruments in a steel case. Lang was in his late 50s now, his hair gray, his face lined by 3 decades of police work. He had been a rookie officer when Sarah Mitchell disappeared, had participated in the original search parties, watched Chief Boswell age under the weight of that unsolved case. As he stood at the excavation site staring at what Mendez had uncovered, he felt history rising like water. Dr. Osman worked methodically, using brushes and small tools to expose what lay beneath. Within 2 hours, she confirmed what everyone suspected. This was a human burial, unofficial and deliberate, the body wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic sheeting that had degraded significantly. The remains were skeletal, suggesting decades underground. She could not determine identity on sight, but there were indicators. The size and structure suggested a young female, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, based on femur measurements. There were fragments of clothing, denim that might have been shorts, rubber that could have been shoe soles. Lang's chest felt tight as he watched Dr. Osman work. He thought about Diane Mitchell, dead for 5 years, who had never stopped placing those anniversary notices. Thought about Michael, gone 3 years, who had begged David to keep searching. Thought about David himself, still living in Cleveland, who had carried his sister's ghost for 27 years. He pulled out his phone, stepped away from the site, his hand unsteady as he called the state police forensics unit. By evening, the site had been cordoned with yellow crime scene tape, portable lights erected to illuminate the area as darkness fell. A forensic team from Columbus arrived with ground-penetrating radar to search for additional evidence. They worked through the night, methodical and silent, while Lang sat in his cruiser drinking cold coffee, writing notes that reminded him painfully of the reports he had read in the original case file. Among the items recovered near the remains, carefully bagged and cataloged, was a small metal object that Dr. Osman identified as a class ring. The inscription was barely legible after decades in wet soil, but under magnification at the lab, they deciphered the year 1983 and initials S.A.M. The skeletal remains discovered in the woods along Old Mill Road were transported to the Ohio State Police Forensic Laboratory in Columbus on May 8, 2009, sealed in evidence containers and accompanied by detailed documentation from the excavation. Dr. Patricia Osman personally oversaw the transfer, understanding the significance of what they had found, the decades of questions that might finally find answers. The lab occupied the second floor of a modern government building, filled with sophisticated equipment, technology that would have seemed impossible to Chief Boswell in 1982. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case was Dr. Kevin Park, a precise man in his early 50s who specialized in cold cases, who had built a career extracting information from remains time had reduced to fragments. He arranged the skeleton on an examination table under bright LED lights and began meticulous analysis. The victim was female, between 18 and 21 years old at time of death, based on dental development and bone fusion. Height approximately 5 feet 4 inches. No obvious trauma to the bones. No fractures or blade marks, though he noted many causes of death left no skeletal evidence. Strangulation, asphyxiation, poisoning, all invisible now. But DNA analysis would prove definitive. Dr. Park extracted samples from the femur, drilling carefully into the dense cortical bone where genetic material was most likely preserved after 3 decades. The samples were processed through polymerase chain reaction amplification, technology that could generate usable DNA profiles from degraded biological material. The process required weeks, patient and exacting, but by early June they had results: a complete mitochondrial DNA profile and a partial nuclear DNA profile, sufficient for comparison. Chief Lang had anticipated this. He contacted David Mitchell, now 42 years old, living in Cleveland Heights with his wife and son. The phone call was difficult, explaining that remains had been found, that they needed a DNA sample from him for comparison, that after 27 years they might finally have answers. David drove to Brookfield the next morning, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. A technician swabbed the inside of his cheek, sealed the sample in a sterile tube, sent it to Columbus. The comparison took 4 days. Mitochondrial DNA passes unchanged from mother to child, meaning David's profile would match his sister's if the remains were Sarah's. On June 19, 2009, Dr. Park called Chief Lang with results. The match was definitive. The remains discovered in the woods were those of Sarah Ann Mitchell, missing since July 23, 1982, presumed dead for 27 years, finally found less than 3 miles from where she had last been seen alive. Lang sat in his office after the call ended, staring at the wall map of Brookfield, marked with locations from the original investigation: Miller's Farm, where the bonfire had been; Route 47, where she had walked; the intersection at Old Mill Road, where her scent had disappeared; and now just a half-mile into the woods from that intersection, the burial site. She had been so close all along. The search parties in 1982 had come within yards, volunteers calling her name, but the burial had been deep enough, concealed well enough that they had walked right past. With positive identification came the next phase, determining cause of death and identifying who had killed her. The class ring recovered at the site was verified through Brookfield High School administrative records. It had been ordered by Sarah Mitchell, engraved with her initials. The denim fragments matched cut-off shorts popular in 1982. But the plastic sheeting was significant. Laboratory analysis identified it as heavy-duty construction-grade plastic, the type used for weatherproofing or covering materials. There were trace fibers embedded in the plastic, synthetic and dark, possibly from vehicle carpeting or upholstery. Dr. Osman had collected soil samples from around and beneath the remains. Forensic soil analysis could identify pollen, mineral content, information that might link the burial site to where Sarah had been killed before being transported. The samples went to a forensic ecology specialist at Ohio State University, a researcher named Dr. Amanda Cross who could interpret soil composition like others read text. But the breakthrough came from evidence sitting in storage for 27 years. The partial tire tracks photographed near Old Mill Road in 1982, the fingerprint fragments lifted from a fence post at the intersection, the witness statements describing a dark pickup truck, all cataloged, preserved, waiting for technology to advance. Lang retrieved the old evidence boxes from storage, carried them upstairs, began re-examination with tools that had not existed when the evidence was first collected. The reinvestigation of Sarah Mitchell's murder consumed Chief Lang through the summer of 2009, spreading across his desk in layers of old reports and new forensic analyses that slowly began forming a coherent picture. The partial tire tracks from 1982, originally considered too common for identification, were submitted to the FBI's database, a system that could compare tread patterns against millions of records. On August 3rd, results came back. The tracks matched Goodyear Wrangler tires, standard issue on 1979 to 1982 Chevrolet and GMC pickup trucks, dark-colored based on paint chips found embedded in the fence post at the intersection. Lang stared at the information on his computer screen, his coffee growing cold. He pulled vehicle registration records from 1982, now digitized, searching for dark pickup trucks registered in Brookfield and surrounding counties. The list was long, hundreds of vehicles, but one name made his breath catch. Gerald Hayes, 71 years old, Marcus Hayes' father, who had owned a 1980 GMC Sierra, dark blue, registered in his name from 1979 through 1984. Gerald Hayes, who had provided his son's alibi, who had sworn Marcus was home by 1 a.m. the night Sarah disappeared, who had confirmed Marcus left for the construction site at 6 a.m. Lang felt something cold settle in his stomach as he pulled Gerald's file from the original investigation. He had been interviewed briefly in 1982 as part of verifying Marcus's timeline. The statement was short, typed on yellowing paper. Gerald had been home that Friday night, asleep, had heard Marcus come in around 1, had woken him at 5:30 for work, had driven with him to the construction site. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, but his truck matched the description Barbara Chen had given, a dark pickup near Old Mill Road. His tires matched the tracks photographed at the intersection. Lang knew tire tracks were not proof of murder. Hundreds of people drove similar trucks, but the location was significant, and timing could not be ignored. He needed more before approaching Gerald, needed to build a case that would not collapse. The forensic soil analysis from Dr. Amanda Cross provided the next piece. The soil samples from around Sarah's remains contained pollen from black walnut and sugar maple, common in the area, but also traces of construction materials. Cement dust, silica sand, mineral oil residue. The concentration was unusual, suggesting the body or the plastic sheeting had been in contact with these substances before burial. The plastic sheeting itself, examined under electron microscopy, showed fibers consistent with vehicle carpeting from early 80s trucks, specifically the rubber-backed carpet used in GMC and Chevrolet models. Lang obtained records from Hayes Construction, the company Gerald had owned in 1982, now defunct but documents preserved in county archives. The business had specialized in residential foundations, cement work. The materials found in Sarah's burial soil matched perfectly. Gerald's truck would have contained construction supplies, tools, plastic sheeting used to cover materials, cement dust embedded in the carpeting. But Lang needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed witness testimony, concrete connections, something definitive. He began quietly interviewing people who had worked for Hayes Construction in 1982, tracking down former employees through property records and online searches. Most had scattered across Ohio. Some had died. But a former worker named Robert Chen living in Dayton remembered Gerald as demanding, particular about his truck, not letting employees use it for personal errands. He remembered the dark blue GMC, always parked at job sites. Remembered thinking it was too nice for construction work. Dark blue pickup. Lang's pulse quickened. He pulled traffic records from 1982, looking for any citations, any documentation placing Gerald's truck near Old Mill Road that night. There were no traffic stops, but a gas station receipt found in archived business records showed Gerald had purchased fuel at the Brookfield Texaco at 11:47 p.m. on July 23, 1982. The Texaco was located on Route 47, directly between Miller's Farm and Old Mill Road. It placed Gerald in the area at the exact time Sarah was walking home. Lang brought in Detective Maria Santos from the State Police Cold Case Unit, a sharp woman in her early 40s who specialized in building prosecutable cases from old evidence. Together they constructed a timeline. Gerald Hayes purchasing gas at 11:47 p.m., driving Route 47 toward his home on the north side of town, a route that would take him directly past the intersection with Old Mill Road. Sarah Mitchell, walking alone on that same road sometime after midnight. An encounter, perhaps an offer of help from someone she knew, her boyfriend's father, someone trusted. And then something went catastrophically wrong. Chief Lang and Detective Santos spent September and early October 2009 building their case with careful precision, understanding they would have one chance to confront Gerald Hayes, that any mistake could destroy 27 years of waiting for justice. They obtained his medical records, looking for injuries around July 1982. They interviewed neighbors from that time, now elderly, chasing memories nearly 3 decades old. They examined his financial records, searching for anomalies, large unexplained purchases. They found nothing dramatic, but the accumulation of small details created a portrait of opportunity and means. On October 12th, they made their move. Gerald Hayes lived in a small ranch house on the east side of Brookfield, a neighborhood of retirees and quiet streets. He had been widowed in 2005 when his wife Carolyn died of heart disease. Now lived alone, spending his days watching television and attending church, a frail man with thinning white hair and trembling hands who walked with a cane. His neighbors considered him harmless, a relic of Brookfield's past. Lang and Santos arrived at 6 a.m., accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a prosecutor from the district attorney's office named Rachel Kim. They chose early morning deliberately, wanting to catch Gerald before he was fully awake, before he could prepare mentally. Lang knocked on the door, his badge visible, his heart pounding. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, about Diane and Michael dying without answers, about David who had carried this burden his entire adult life. Gerald answered the door in a bathrobe and slippers, confusion crossing his face when he saw the police. His first words were, "Is Marcus okay? What happened?" The concern seemed genuine, immediate, the instinct of a father. Lang introduced Detective Santos, asked if they could come inside. Gerald stepped back, nodding slowly, leading them into a living room that smelled of old newspapers and dust, photographs of his grandchildren covering the walls. They sat on furniture that sagged, decades old, while Gerald lowered himself carefully onto his recliner, looking bewildered and increasingly frightened as Lang explained why they were there. They had reopened Sarah Mitchell's case, Lang said. They had found her remains. They had new evidence. They needed to ask some questions. Gerald's face went pale, his hands beginning to shake on the armrests. He asked if he needed a lawyer. Santos said that was his right. that he could call one immediately, but they hoped he would help them understand some things first. What followed was 4 hours of careful, methodical interrogation conducted in that small living room with the photographs watching. Lang asked about July 23, 1982. Gerald said he barely remembered, it was so long ago. Lang asked about the gas purchase at the Texaco. Gerald said yes, he often bought gas there, he did not recall that specific night. Lang asked about the dark blue GMC. Gerald said yes, he had loved that truck, it was reliable. His voice was steady, but his hands would not stop shaking. Then Lang placed the tire track analysis on the coffee table between them, explained how they matched Gerald's truck, how they were found near where Sarah disappeared. Gerald stared at the document, his breathing shallow. He said he did not know how that was possible. He drove that road every day, his tires would be everywhere. Santos asked why he would have stopped near Old Mill Road after midnight. Gerald had no answer. The soil evidence came next, the construction materials found with Sarah's remains, the plastic sheeting consistent with his work supplies. Gerald's face had gone from pale to gray, sweat appearing on his forehead despite the cool morning. He asked again about a lawyer. Kim, the prosecutor, said he should absolutely call one, that they were placing him under arrest for the murder of Sarah Ann Mitchell. The words hit Gerald like a physical blow. He made a choking sound, his body folding forward. The uniformed officers moved toward him and he raised his hands, trembling. An old man suddenly looking ancient, all pretense of confusion falling away to reveal exhaustion or perhaps relief. As they read him his rights, Gerald whispered, "I tried to help her. I only wanted to help." It was not a legal confession, not something admissible without his attorney present. But everyone in that room heard it, heard 27 years of secrets breaking open. Gerald Hayes' arrest on October 12, 2009 detonated through Brookfield like an explosion, the shock radiating outward in waves of disbelief and horror. By afternoon, news crews from Columbus and Cincinnati had descended, satellite trucks filling parking lots, reporters interviewing anyone willing to speak. The man who had employed half the town at some point, who had coached Little League, who had sat in the same church pew for 40 years, had been charged with murdering Sarah Mitchell. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, the inability to reconcile the quiet grandfather with the monster who had buried a 19-year-old woman in the woods and let her family suffer for 27 years. Gerald had been transferred to the county jail, held without bail given the severity of charges and flight risk. His court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Thomas Wright with 20 years of capital case experience, advised him to say nothing, to wait for prosecution to reveal its hand. But Gerald was collapsing, the weight of nearly 3 decades of secrecy crushing him. On his 4th night in custody, he asked to speak with Chief Lang and Detective Santos, against his attorney's vehement protests. Wright sat beside him during the interview, his jaw clenched, warning Gerald repeatedly that anything said could be used against him. But Gerald seemed beyond caring. The interview took place in a gray concrete room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a digital recorder capturing every word. Gerald looked diminished by the orange jumpsuit and steel table. He folded his hands in front of him, the age spots prominent, and began speaking in a voice that cracked and steadied and cracked again. He had seen Sarah walking that night, he said after leaving a late job site, checking on a foundation pour. It was dark and she was alone, and he had known her since she was a child, had watched her grow up, had employed her boyfriend, his own son. He had stopped to offer her a ride. It was the neighborly thing to do, the right thing. Sarah had gotten in willingly, gratefully because she knew him, trusted him. But something had happened during that drive, something Gerald struggled to articulate. He had made a comment, he said, about how pretty she looked, how grown up she was becoming. She had laughed politely, uncomfortably. He had reached over, touched her shoulder. She had pulled away, asked him to stop, said she wanted out. And Gerald, instead of apologizing, instead of stopping immediately, had kept driving, turning onto Old Mill Road, his mind filling with something dark and consuming that he claimed not to understand, even as he acted on it. Detective Santos listened without expression, her pen moving steadily. Lang felt sick, imagining Sarah's terror as she realized Marcus's father, the man she trusted, was taking her somewhere isolated, as help transformed into threat. Gerald continued, speaking faster, desperate to explain, to make them understand he was not a monster, that it had been an accident. She had tried to open the door while they were moving. They had struggled. He had grabbed her to stop her, his hands around her throat pressing, not meaning to kill, just trying to make her stop screaming. Wright interrupted forcefully, telling Gerald to stop talking, that he was confessing to murder, that he needed to think. But Gerald shook his head, tears streaming down his face, kept going. When Sarah stopped moving, stopped breathing, he had panicked, driven deeper into the woods along Old Mill Road, an area he knew from hunting. He had wrapped her body in plastic sheeting from his truck bed, construction material he always carried. He had buried her in the dark, his hands shaking, dirt under his fingernails. And then he had driven home, parked the GMC in his garage, and sat at his kitchen table until dawn, trying to convince himself it had not happened. But when Marcus came home around 1 a.m., Gerald had forced himself to act normal, to pretend everything was fine. When police questioned him days later, he had lied, provided Marcus an alibi to protect him from suspicion, but really to protect himself. He had lived with it every single day for 27 years, watched the Mitchells grieve, watched the town tear itself apart, watched his own son flee to Pittsburgh to escape suspicion Gerald had created. And he had said nothing, done nothing, let them all suffer while he went to church and coached baseball and pretended to be a decent man. The confession was recorded, documented, witnessed. But the revelations did not end there. As the investigation continued, Detective Santos began following threads that led to darker places. Gerald had not acted entirely alone, not in maintaining the secret, not in the cover-up that lasted nearly 3 decades. Phone records from 1982, painstakingly reconstructed from archived billing statements, showed a call from Gerald's home phone to another Brookfield number at 3:42 in the morning on July 24th, hours after Sarah died. The number belonged to Vincent Calabrese, 73 years old now, who had been Gerald's business partner in Hayes Construction since 1975, who had retired in 1995 when the company dissolved. When detectives arrived at Vincent's apartment on October 20th, they found him sitting at his kitchen table, as if he had been expecting them. He had known this day would come, he said, had known it for 27 years. Yes, Gerald had called him that night, terrified and desperate. And Vincent had driven out to Old Mill Road, had helped dig deeper, had helped move Sarah's body to a more concealed location, had helped clean the GMC's interior with bleach and solvent. He had done it because Gerald was his partner, his friend, because they had built a business together, because loyalty meant something. Vincent Calabrese was arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact, with obstruction of justice, with helping to conceal a homicide. His confession led to another name. Carolyn Hayes, Gerald's wife who died in 2005, had known. Vincent admitted under questioning, his voice heavy with regret. Gerald had told her weeks after the burial, unable to carry the secret alone, and Carolyn had chosen to protect her husband over a dead girl, chosen to preserve their family, their business, their standing in the community. She had taken that choice to her grave, never once suggesting Gerald turn himself in, never once thinking of the Mitchells' suffering. There was one more person who emerged from the investigation, reluctantly, painfully. Andrew Morrison, now 68, who had been the county medical examiner in 1982, the one who had examined the tire track casts, who had declared them too common for identification. Detective Santos found inconsistencies in his original report compared to the photographs, evidence suggesting he had intentionally limited the analysis. When confronted, Morrison admitted he had been a client of Hayes Construction, had owed Gerald money from a loan, that he had agreed to provide minimal forensic analysis in exchange for debt forgiveness. He had never imagined it would lead to decades of injustice. He insisted had thought the tire tracks genuinely were too common, had convinced himself he was not really doing anything wrong. Andrew Morrison was charged with evidence tampering and obstruction. The web of complicity spread wider than anyone anticipated, revealing how easily ordinary people could choose to protect evil when it wore a familiar face. The trial of Gerald Hayes began on April 5, 2010, in the Franklin County Courthouse, a proceeding that drew national media attention and filled the gallery with journalists, true crime followers, and Brookfield residents who needed to witness justice finally served. David Mitchell sat in the front row every single day, his wife Jennifer beside him, his son occasionally accompanying him when school allowed. He was 43 now, his auburn hair touched with gray, his face lined but determined. He had promised his father he would find Sarah, and though the finding had come too late for Michael and Diane to witness, David was there to represent them, to be their eyes and voice. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Kim, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, Gerald's recorded confession, and testimony from Vincent Calabrese, who agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. The defense, led by Thomas Wright, hampered by Gerald's own admissions but obligated to mount a defense, argued for manslaughter rather than murder, claimed Gerald had panicked, had not intended to kill Sarah, that 27 years of being a productive citizen should matter. But the evidence was overwhelming. The plastic sheeting, the construction materials, the tire tracks, the dark blue GMC, the phone call to Vincent in the early morning hours, the gas station receipt placing him in the area. Each piece was presented, examined, authenticated. Sarah's class ring, corroded but still bearing her initials, was shown to the jury in a clear evidence bag, and several jurors wiped their eyes. Dr. Patricia Osmond testified about the recovery of the remains, about the careful excavation, about the young woman who had been buried and forgotten in those woods for 27 years. Her testimony was clinical yet compassionate, and when she finished, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Gerald himself took the stand against his attorney's strong advice, perhaps hoping that explaining directly might generate sympathy. Instead, his testimony revealed a man who had constructed elaborate justifications, who had convinced himself over decades that Sarah's death had been a tragic accident, rather than the result of predatory behavior. He claimed he had never intended harm, that he had offered a ride out of kindness, that her panic had caused the struggle. He wept on the stand, his hands shaking, but his tears felt hollow even to those inclined toward mercy. The cross-examination was devastating. Kim walked Gerald through every choice that night. The decision to touch Sarah inappropriately, the turn onto Old Mill Road when she asked to get out, the refusal to stop, the hand around her throat. Kim forced Gerald to acknowledge that each decision had been deliberate, calculated, the actions of a man who saw an opportunity and took it. By the time Gerald stepped down, his defense lay in ruins. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days, returning on April 26th with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse. Gerald showed no reaction, simply stared at his hands as if already gone. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Life in prison without possibility of parole. At 71 years old, Gerald Hayes would die behind bars. Vincent Calabrese, who testified for the prosecution, received 15 years for his role in the cover-up. Andrew Morrison, the medical examiner who compromised the original investigation, was sentenced to 6 years and lost his medical license permanently. The 3 men who conspired to bury Sarah Mitchell's murder were finally held accountable, though justice came far too late for those who loved her. David Mitchell stood outside the courthouse after sentencing, microphones thrust toward him, reporters shouting questions. He spoke quietly, his voice steady despite tears in his eyes. He thanked Chief Lang and Detective Santos, thanked Dr. Osman and Dr. Park, thanked everyone who worked to bring Sarah home. He said his parents had died broken but would rest easier now knowing justice was served. He said Sarah had been bright and kind, had wanted to be a teacher, had deserved a full life that Gerald Hayes stole from her. And then he said he was done talking about Gerald Hayes, that he would not give him another moment, that from now on he would remember only Sarah. Brookfield itself struggled to process what had been revealed. The realization that a trusted community member had committed murder, that others had helped him hide it. The Hayes construction office building, now abandoned, became an unwanted landmark. Some residents avoided it. Others stood outside staring, trying to reconcile memories of getting work done with the knowledge of what Gerald had done. The town's sense of itself had been shattered twice, first in 1982 when Sarah disappeared, and again in 2009 when they learned who took her. Sarah Ann Mitchell was finally laid to rest on May 20, 2010, 27 years after her death, in a ceremony attended by hundreds. Her grave in Hillside Cemetery overlooked farmland, peaceful and green, marked by a headstone that read simply, "Beloved daughter and sister forever in our hearts." 1963 to 1982. David visited every week without fail, bringing flowers, speaking to Sarah about his son, about life, about the justice that finally, impossibly, arrived. The case became a landmark in cold case investigation, cited in forensic journals and law enforcement training programs, as proof that modern technology could solve cases that seemed permanently closed. But for those who lived through it, who carried Sarah's absence for decades, the resolution brought complicated emotions, relief and grief intertwined, justice delivered but at a cost that could never be repaid. Brookfield would carry this story forever. A town that learned too late that monsters do not announce themselves, that they wear familiar faces and friendly smiles, and that sometimes the only thing separating tragedy from justice is the refusal to stop searching for truth, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply the secrets are buried.